Hi everybody, I'm Robin Puglia, nutritional therapist and certified functional medicine practitioner, and I am the lead of the Autoimmune Academy professional mentoring program. And I actually just wanted to quickly share something that has come up in my clinical consults and also in my professional mentoring several times in the last month. And when something pops up again and again, I think this is probably something that other people need to know, so I thought I'd share. And it is that I strongly recommend gluten and dairy antibody testing, so food reactivity testing, if somebody has any type of neurological inflammation or blood-brain barrier permeability, even if it isn't autoimmune related or related to food in an obvious way. So I 100% recommend that somebody does gluten and dairy antibody testing after a head injury, a whiplash injury, if they fall off a horse, if they've injured themselves playing rugby, if there's any type of traumatic brain injury, even if it's relatively minor, but especially if they've had something like a concussion, as quickly as possible. Really, I'm following up with the bloods as quickly as I possibly can if the person is eating gluten and dairy. Now, another situation that I'm testing gluten and dairy as an automatic follow-up is when there has been an infection that has affected the brain. So if a child has PANS or PANDAS or any other type of neurological symptoms or neurological inflammation as a result of an infection or as a result of a toxic exposure like mold, then it's an automatic, we've got to run gluten and dairy antibodies for me. That's my automatic thought process and an automatic, very strong recommendation for me. Why? Why am I doing that, right? If somebody has PANS or PANDAS and we know that the problem is strep or mold or Epstein-Barr virus, why am I thinking about gluten and dairy? So the reason is this. The blood-brain barrier should keep antibodies in the body and away from the brain. You can see here in this image, they're looking at autoreactive antibodies, but I'm just borrowing the image to explain myself. But you can see that when the tight junctions are intact, that in fact the astrocytes and the neurons, so the cells of the brain and the central nervous system, are protected from the antibodies, that the tight junctions of the blood-brain barrier are keeping any antibodies to foods, to infections, to toxins, or autoantibodies in the body and away from the brain and the nervous system. And it doesn't matter how many antibodies there are. So whether or not you have a few antibodies to gliadin or to dairy, or you have many, if somebody is very gluten reactive and very dairy reactive, as long as that blood-brain barrier is intact, the brain is protected. And the reason it's important that the brain is protected is because gliadin and gliadin antibodies and dairy antibodies have been shown to cross-react with regions of the brain or nervous system tissue. So gliadin reacts with asialoganglioside, cerebellar tissue, the Purkinje cells, myelin basic protein, and synapsin. And dairy proteins have been shown to cross-react with myelin basic protein, myelin oligodendric glycoprotein, and the cerebellum as well. And however, when somebody's blood-brain barrier is intact, those dairy proteins and those dairy protein antibodies do not have the opportunity to cross-react with the nervous system tissue because the blood-brain barrier is doing its job, and those food proteins and antibodies are kept in the body and away from the nervous system tissue. But what happens when you have blood-brain barrier dysfunction? When you have blood-brain barrier dysfunction, it almost doesn't matter how many antibodies there are, if there are any, right? So if it's a minor situation and there's just a few, or if there is a lot of antibodies or, to the gliadin or to the dairy, then we have access of those food proteins and those antibodies, or that antigen antibody complex, to the astrocytes and to the neurons. And this can result in anything from minor neuronal damage to extensive damage, and may result in neurological autoimmunity. But in somebody whose brain is inflamed from an infection, one of the things that's almost automatic when you have had an injury, a whiplash, a fall, a concussion, or a recent infection, is that you will have blood-brain barrier permeability. Now, the other thing to understand is that roughly 50%, no, sorry, 20% of people in the healthy population will have antibodies to gluten and dairy, and it won't necessarily be causing them any overt dysfunction or any overt issues. 20% of ostensibly healthy people have got antibodies to gliadin or gluten or dairy or wheat. And so understanding if this person with this infection, PANDAS, whiplash, concussion, neurological dysfunction of any kind, neurological immunity of any autoimmunity of any kind, is in that 20%, is critical to understanding how to prevent further damage or to set up a concurrent problem via these antibodies. So the other thing to understand is if that person is one of the people, 1 in 5, who has these antibodies, then that additional challenge of the gluten reactivity, dairy reactivity will be throwing fuel on the fire from the infection, from the injury, and has the potential to really snowball it into something else. So I wouldn't automatically just take somebody gluten or dairy free, although you definitely can when you are trying to dampen down neurological inflammation. But the question becomes, does this person need to be permanently gluten and dairy free, or is this just a temporary measure to keep the antigen level low, to keep inflammation kind of managed while we are helping this brain to recover? Or do they need to be permanently off gluten or permanently off dairy? You know, if somebody has got neurological Lyme and gliadin antibodies, for me, that's a person that probably needs to be off gluten for the, you know, for a life. If they don't have the antibodies, then you might take them gluten-free as part of a brain recovery program, but perhaps they can come back on gluten once they are in a stable, recovered place. So the dots are not necessarily that obvious. You know, somebody's got neurological Lyme, I'm immediately testing them for gliadin and dairy antibodies. If somebody's got PANS or PANDAS, I'm testing them for gliadin and dairy antibodies. If somebody's had a traumatic brain injury, a concussion, or a whiplash type injury, I'm automatically testing them for gliadin and dairy antibodies. I want to know that antibody status so that I can understand the risk to their brain of inflammation from eating those foods, and whether or not we're talking about temporary restriction or, you know, permanent, lifelong, more careful restriction. So I just thought I'd share that with you in case that is helpful for your clinical practice. Thanks for being part of my community.